story, the crawl space intruder. What would you do if the sanctuary of your home turned into a living nightmare? For one woman, her cozy rental held a horrifying secret, a man hiding beneath her floorboards, plotting in the shadows. It was a small, charming house, nothing fancy, but it had an undeniable warmth about it. Tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, there was something undeniably comforting about it, a space that felt personal, like it had seen 1,000 families come and go but was still standing strong, a witness to decades of secrets. But it wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. The house had a crawl space underneath, access through a small wooden hatch hidden beneath the floorboards in the laundry room. The door was old, weathered, but still functional. It wasn't particularly large, just enough space for someone to crawl through, to hide away from the world above. I never thought much of it at first. To be honest, I figured it was just a relic of the house's past. Who would want to be down there? Cobwebs, rats, dust, nothing worth thinking about. I hadn't even bothered to look inside. It started on an ordinary evening. I'd had a long day at work, the kind that drained you both physically and mentally, the kind that made you yearn for nothing more than the comfort of your bed, a hot shower, and the peace that comes from being alone. I came home later than usual, around 9 p.m., the weight of the world still on my shoulders. The house was silent when I stepped inside. I could smell the faint scent of laundry detergent lingering in the air, mixing with the musty scent of old wood. It was almost too quiet, too still. I shrugged it off as the tiredness making me feel jumpy as I walked through the door. But something wasn't right. I stepped into the laundry room, and that's when I noticed it. The light was on. The small overhead light in the laundry room was glowing a soft yellow. Now, I could have sworn I'd turned it off that morning when I left. I made a habit of double-checking everything before I went out, especially in the laundry room where I kept all my cleaning supplies. But there it was, on. I chalked it up to me being absent-minded, perhaps rushing out the door too quickly that morning. I flicked the switch off with a slight sigh, but as I turned to walk away, something caught my eye. The hatch to the crawl space was slightly ajar. That wasn't right. It had been securely shut that morning. I knew it. I remembered locking it before leaving. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the hatch. My heart began to thump a little faster, a sense of unease creeping up my spine. I told myself it had to be nothing. Maybe the wind had somehow loosened the latch, or it had shifted while I was away. But I wasn't convinced. I approached the hatch slowly, cautiously, and peered into the dark space beneath the house. There was no sound, no skittering of rats or movement. It was just quiet, still. I leaned over and checked the lock. It was intact, but the hatch was still slightly ajar. Something wasn't right. I pushed the door shut, harder than necessary. The small creak of the wood echoed through the room. For a moment, I stood there, contemplating whether to call someone to check it out, but dismissed the thought. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Later that night, I went to bed, the weight of the day still hanging heavy on me. I turned off the lights and pulled the blankets tightly around me. The wind outside was strong, howling against the windows, but that was nothing unusual. I drifted off to sleep, the quiet hum of the house surrounding me. That is, until I was woken by the faintest sound. At first, I thought it was the wind again, rattling the windows. But as I lay there in the dark, my senses began to sharpen. It wasn't the wind. It was thumping, a rhythmic thumping, almost like footsteps, but heavier, more deliberate. I lay still in my bed, barely breathing, my mind racing. It was coming from below, the laundry room, the crawl space. My stomach dropped. I knew what I had heard earlier. The hatch had been opened. Had someone gotten in? I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, a faint thud, thud, thud. It was hard to breathe now. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and slowly, quietly, crept out of bed. The cold floor beneath my bare feet sent a shiver up my spine, but I ignored it, moving silently toward the laundry room. I opened the door just a crack, enough to peer inside. Everything was dark, silent. The light was off now. The thumping had stopped. But there, in the middle of the room, I saw it. The hatch was open, wider than before. I felt my chest tighten. My hands shook as I turned the light on. The light flickered once and then stabilized, casting a pale glow on the floor. My eyes darted to the hatch. The box of detergent I'd placed on top of it was now pushed to the side. I stared in disbelief. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. With my heart pounding in my chest, I slowly approached the hatch. I felt a rush of cold air rising from the crawl space, but there was no sound now. I looked down, my fingers brushing the edge of the hatch. Before I could even make a decision on what to do next, I heard a noise from behind me, a faint shuffle of footsteps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around so quickly I almost lost my balance. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the doorway to the hallway, stood a figure. A man. He was crouched down, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide open, unblinking. His skin was sickly, like something that had been hidden away for far too long. His clothes were torn, disheveled, and he stood there, in my laundry room, as if he belonged. My heart raced as I locked eyes with him, both of us startled by the sudden confrontation. He didn't move. His mouth was slightly open, as though he was about to speak, but no words came out. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my body was frozen. I could feel his presence, as if it was suffocating the very air around me. His breath was shallow, like he hadn't spoken or breathed properly in days. I had no idea how he had gotten in, how long he had been hiding in the crawl space. But what truly terrified me was the look on his face. And then, as if to complete the nightmare, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, tattered notebook. His fingers flipped it open, revealing pages filled with tiny, obsessive handwriting. It was all about me. Notes on my daily routine, the exact time I left for work, what I wore, what time I came home. He had been watching me. He had been studying me. His eyes flickered to mine again, and I finally broke free of the shock. I screamed, my voice tearing through the silence of the room. I turned and bolted for the door, my legs moving faster than I ever thought possible. I heard him shuffle after me, but I didn't look back. I ran out into the night, banging on my neighbor's door, desperate for help. When the police arrived, they found him. He was hiding in the crawl space, barely clothed, with a small mattress and food wrappers strewn about the dirt floor. The hatch had been tampered with, and from the looks of it, he had been living there for days, weeks, maybe even longer. But the worst part came when the police found the notebook. They wouldn't tell me everything that was written in it, but I didn't need to know. The thought that someone had been silently observing me, learning my routine, planning, it made my skin crawl. I moved out of the house the next week, leaving behind everything I had built in that small, quiet neighborhood. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the thought. What were his plans for me? What had he intended to do? I still don't know. And maybe, in some ways, it's better that I don't. Sometimes, the scariest part of life is not knowing what's waiting for you in the shadows. But sometimes, it's knowing that danger can look like someone you trust. In the next story, a man on his late night walk discovers just how terrifying it is when the danger seems to come from those who should protect you. Story: the creepy gas station delivery. What would you do if a simple food delivery turned into a terrifying encounter with someone who seemed off? It started as a routine gig. The gas station was in the middle of nowhere, just another stop in my night shift as a delivery driver. I didn't think twice when the order came in: a burger, fries, and a soda for someone named Jake. The directions were clear, the timing perfect, but when I arrived, something about the gas station felt wrong. The pumps were empty, the lot dimly lit by a flickering overhead light, and the small convenience store was closed for the night. Still, I waited in my car, scanning the lot for any sign of Jake. Minutes passed. That's when I saw it, a truck pulling into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The man behind the wheel didn't look like the kind of person who would order a burger and fries. His eyes met mine through the windshield, and a chill ran down my spine. It was in that moment I realized I might have made a mistake coming here, but by then, it was too late to leave unnoticed. As a delivery driver for a local food joint, I'd gotten used to late-night runs. They were usually uneventful, dropping off burgers, wings, or pizzas to night owls and overworked employees. But this delivery was different from the start. The order came in around 10:30 p.m., just as I was getting ready to finish my shift. It was a straightforward request: a burger, fries, and a soda, to be delivered to a gas station off Route 12. Route 12 wasn't a place I delivered to often. It was a stretch of road cutting through farmland and wooded areas, with little more than a few scattered houses and an old diner. The gas station itself was small and isolated, the kind of place you'd stop at only if you were desperate. Still, it seemed simple enough. I grabbed the food, punched the address into my GPS, and headed out. The drive took me down winding roads, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The radio crackled with static, and I eventually turned it off, opting for the rhythmic hum of my tires on the pavement. When I finally pulled into the gas station, the unease hit me immediately. The gas station looked abandoned, though I knew it wasn't. One of the pumps had a dim light over it, flickering sporadically, and the convenience store was dark, its windows covered by metal shutters. A single soda machine stood near the entrance, its fluorescent light buzzing faintly. I parked near the pumps and sent a quick message through the delivery app: "Here with your order." No response. I waited, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I checked my phone again. Still no reply. That's when I noticed the truck. The truck pulled into the lot slowly, its engine rumbling loudly in the quiet night. It was an older model, with a dented hood and a layer of grime that made its color hard to determine. The headlights illuminated the lot as it rolled to a stop about 20 feet from my car. The driver didn't get out right away. Instead, he sat there, his silhouette barely visible through the dirty windshield. I could feel his eyes on me, though I couldn't see his face. Finally, the door creaked open, and he stepped out. He was tall, with a wiry frame, and wore a heavy jacket despite the mild weather. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached my car. "You got food for me?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Are you Jake?" I asked, holding up the bag. He stopped a few feet from my car, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah, that's me." But something about his tone didn't feel right. I handed him the bag through the window, keeping my engine running just in case. He took it but didn't walk away. Instead, he lingered, his eyes scanning my car. "You always deliver out here?" he asked, his voice casual but with an undertone I couldn't place. "Not often," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Just wherever the app sends me." He nodded slowly, then glanced at the soda sitting in my cup holder. "That mine?" "Oh, yeah," I said, reaching for it. As I handed it over, his hand brushed mine briefly. His skin was cold and rough, like he'd been working outside all day. "Thanks," he said, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. "Well, have a good night," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Instead of responding, he smirked. "You too." Then he turned and walked back to his truck, but something about the way he moved made my stomach churn. I watched him climb into his truck and sit there for a moment, the engine idling. I didn't wait to find out what he was doing. Shifting into reverse, I backed out of my spot and headed for the exit. In my rearview mirror, I saw his truck pull out behind me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he was heading home, taking the same route I was. But as I turned onto the highway, his headlights stayed close behind. Too close. My heart began to race. I accelerated slightly, hoping he would pass, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed right on my bumper, his brights flashing intermittently. "What the hell is this guy doing?" I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the road stretched on, the truck grew more aggressive. He swerved into the other lane briefly, as if trying to overtake me, but then fell back. The headlights illuminated my car's interior, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel more claustrophobic. I spotted a gas station up ahead and decided to pull in, hoping he would keep driving. But as I slowed down, so did he. Panic set in. I changed my mind at the last second, veering back onto the highway. The truck followed, its horn blaring angrily. By now, I was going well over the speed limit, my hands trembling as I tried to stay in control. The road ahead was dark and empty, offering no signs of help. Finally, I spotted a small diner with a brightly lit parking lot. I swerved into it, my tires screeching as I came to a stop near the entrance. The truck pulled in behind me, but then it stopped. For a moment, I thought he was going to get out, but instead, he just sat there, his headlights glaring into my rearview mirror. Then, without warning, he backed out of the lot and sped away, disappearing into the night. It took me several minutes to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking as I called the police, explaining what had happened. When the officer arrived, I described the truck and the man as best as I could, but there wasn't much they could do. Probably just some creep trying to scare you, the officer said. Let us know if you see him again. The encounter left me shaken. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was he? Why did he follow me? What would have happened if I hadn't made it to the diner? I still deliver food occasionally, but I'm much more cautious now. Every time I pull into a dark lot or wait for a customer, I can't help but scan the area, half expecting to see that truck again. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed calm or panicked like I did? Some nights, when I'm driving down empty roads, I still feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Story: the creepy taxi driver. Imagine trusting someone to take you home, only to realize they might be planning something sinister. Tonight's tale from Wolf Tales will make you think twice about your next ride. If you want more bone-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. It had been a long but enjoyable weekend. I had flown to San Diego to visit an old college friend, soaking up a few days of much-needed rest and sunshine. By the time my late-night flight touched down back home, exhaustion had settled into my bones. All I wanted was to get home, throw my bags in the corner, and collapse into bed. It was just past midnight when I made my way to the ground transportation pickup area outside the airport. The air was biting cold, a stark contrast to San Diego's balmy weather. The lot was eerily quiet, with only a handful of travelers shuffling to and from their rides. I had initially planned to call an Uber, but seeing a line of taxis waiting nearby, I decided it would be faster. A yellow minivan caught my eye. The driver, a man in his mid-40s with a graying beard and tired eyes, leaned out of the window. "Need a ride?" he called out. "Yes," I replied, dragging my carry-on behind me. "How much to my address?" $30, he said with a shrug. It seemed reasonable, and I was too tired to haggle or think twice. "Works for me," I said, opening the back door and sliding in. The interior of the taxi was worn but clean, the faint scent of air freshener mingling with an undercurrent of cigarette smoke. I placed my bag on the seat beside me, buckled my seatbelt, and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. As we pulled away, I noticed the driver glance at me through the rearview mirror. The first time, I ignored it. The second time, it made my skin prickle. "Long flight?" he asked casually, his eyes flicking back to the road. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone polite but distant. "Where were you coming from?" "San Diego," I said. "Ah, San Diego," he mused. "Bet it's nice out there this time of year. What were you doing?" "Just visiting a friend," I replied, shifting uncomfortably. His question seemed innocent enough, but there was something about the way he asked them, like he was fishing for something. "Visiting a friend." "Huh," he said, a hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "A pretty girl like you probably has a lot of friends." The comment felt like a slap. It was inappropriate, unnecessary, and far too personal. I forced a tight smile, hoping he'd drop it. The highway stretched out before us, empty save for a few scattered cars. I focused on the blur of streetlights flashing by, trying to tune him out, but he wasn't finished. "You live alone?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he were asking about the weather. "No," I lied instinctively. "I live with my boyfriend." "Oh, yeah?" he said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror again. "What's his name?" My stomach tightened. Why would he ask that? My mind raced, trying to come up with a believable answer. "Jake," I said, the first name that came to mind. For a moment, the car was silent. save for the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Then he chuckled softly. Jake. Huh. Lucky guy. I clenched my fists in my lap, my heart pounding. Something was off. I glanced at the GPS mounted on his dashboard, but it was angled just out of view. The highway signs told me we were approaching my exit. This is my exit, I said firmly, sitting up straighter. He didn't slow down. Hey, you missed it, I said louder, my voice tinged with panic. Relax, he replied, his tone unnervingly calm. I'll catch the next one. My pulse quickened. The next exit was several miles away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he had no intention of taking it. Where are you going? I demanded. I know a shortcut, he said smoothly. No, I snapped. I don't want a shortcut. Turn around. His grip on the wheel tightened, but he said nothing. My mind raced, weighing my options. Jumping out of a moving car was out of the question, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my phone and opened the text thread with my family. I typed out a quick message, something's wrong, sharing my location. My hands shook as I hit send and shared my live location with a few close contacts. The driver's voice broke the silence. You texting your boyfriend? He asked, his tone laced with something that sounded like mockery. Yes, I said without hesitation, hoping it would deter him. Good, he said. He should know how lucky he is. We approached a red light, the first we'd hit since leaving the airport. My eyes darted around, searching for an opportunity to escape. That's when I saw it, a police car parked in an empty lot just ahead. Without thinking, I grabbed my bag, unbuckled my seatbelt, and yanked the door handle. What the hell are you doing? The driver shouted, reaching for the power controls to lock the doors. I shoved the door open and bolted, the cold air biting my face as I sprinted toward the police car. The driver yelled something after me, but I didn't stop. The officer stepped out of the car, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. Mississippi, are you okay? I pointed back at the taxi, which was already speeding away. He wouldn't let me out. I gasped. He missed my exit on purpose. I think he was going to. My voice broke, the weight of the moment catching up with me. The officer guided me into the back seat of his cruiser and radioed for backup. He assured me they'd look into it, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find him. No receipt, no license plate, nothing to trace. When I finally got home, it was almost 2 a.m. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. My nerves still raw. Despite my exhaustion, sleep felt impossible. At 3 a.m., the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. I froze, my heart pounding. Then it grew louder, more insistent. I crept to the peephole, my breath shallow. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing on the porch, his features partially obscured by the dim light. He was dressed in a dark jacket, his posture stiff and unnatural. Sweetheart, it's me, he called, his voice eerily calm. Open the door. It sounded like my father's voice, but it couldn't be. My father lived 2 hours away, and I hadn't told him I was back. I backed away from the door, clutching my phone. The knocking continued, each thud reverberating through the apartment. Eventually, it stopped, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I learned from my neighbor George that someone had been peering through my windows shortly after I got home. George thought it was my father, but when I called him, he confirmed he'd been at work all night. I installed cameras and changed my locks, but the fear lingered. Was it the taxi driver? Someone he knew? Or was it an entirely different predator? I moved to a new apartment shortly after, but I never felt truly safe again. Story: the empty house horror. Have you ever woken up and felt that something was wrong, even before opening your eyes? Maybe it's the eerie silence, or the faint feeling of being watched. Now, imagine waking up on a quiet Christmas night, expecting peace, but finding wet footprints leading from an open window in your home. Footprints that end right next to your bed. This happened to me one winter night. A memory I've tried to bury but can't escape. The house had been so still when I fell asleep, the snow outside muffling every sound. I had locked all the doors, checked every window, and settled in for what I thought would be a quiet evening. But when I woke up, the silence felt heavier. That's when I noticed the faint outline of muddy shoe prints on the carpet. They started by the living room window, trailed through the hallway, and ended just a few feet from where I was lying. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. What would you do if you discovered someone had been watching you while you slept? The week leading up to Christmas had been hectic. Work deadlines, last-minute shopping, and an endless stream of holiday invitations had left me drained. So, when my family decided to spend Christmas out of town, I jumped at the chance to stay home alone. It wasn't that I didn't love them, I just craved peace. The idea of a quiet evening by the fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, and a classic holiday movie sounded perfect. The snow began falling early that evening, a steady, peaceful curtain of white that blanketed the neighborhood. By the time the sun set, the street outside was empty, and the only sound was the soft crunch of snow whenever a stray car passed by. I locked the doors, checked all the windows, and turned off the porch light. My old house had a way of creaking in the wind, so I wasn't taking any chances with an unlocked door. By 11 p.m., I was tucked into bed, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. I fell asleep almost immediately, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes after weeks of exhaustion. I don't know what woke me. At first, I thought it was the cold. My room was noticeably chillier than it had been when I went to bed. But as I opened my eyes, a strange sensation crept over me, an unsettling awareness, like the room was holding its breath. The first thing I noticed was the window. It was open just a crack, letting in a draft that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't remember leaving it open. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, a trail of wet, muddy prints leading from the living room into the hallway. My heart began to race as I followed the trail with my eyes, my breath catching when I saw where they ended, right beside my bed. The air felt heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't see. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. But curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. Slowly, I sat up, my eyes darting around the room for any signs of movement. The house was silent, too silent. Grabbing my phone from the nightstand, I turned on the flashlight and shone it toward the footprints. The beam of light illuminated the wet marks, their edges smudged as if whoever made them had moved carefully, almost deliberately. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet brushing against the cold floor. The prints were still damp, glistening slightly in the dim light. I followed them back down the hallway, my heart pounding with every step. The trail led me to the living room, where the window was fully open now, snow piling up on the sill. The cold wind whipped through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and pine. I stepped closer, noticing that the snow outside the window was disturbed, footprints leading away from the house and disappearing into the darkness beyond the yard. But something else caught my attention. Sitting on the floor beneath the window was a small, muddy object. I leaned down cautiously, shining my flashlight on it. It was a toy soldier, the kind you'd find in a child's playset. My stomach churned. I didn't own anything like that. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a sudden noise shattered the silence, a faint creak, coming from upstairs. The sound was unmistakable, like someone shifting their weight on the old wooden floorboards. I froze, my mind racing. Was someone still in the house? Clutching my phone tightly, I backed away from the window and moved toward the stairs. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last as I ascended. When I reached the top of the stairs, I listened intently, every nerve on edge. The creaking had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I pushed open the door to the spare bedroom, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed, and the curtains drawn tightly shut. But then I saw it, a second set of footprints, these ones leading from the window to the closet. My throat went dry. Whoever had been in my house was still here. I approached the closet cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The air felt colder here, as if the intruder had left behind a trace of their presence. With a deep breath, I yanked the door open. It was empty, but just as I turned away, I heard a faint whisper, a single word I couldn't quite make out. That was enough for me. I bolted down the stairs, grabbing my car keys and coat on the way out. I didn't stop running until I was safely locked inside my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the house. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. My hands were shaking so badly that it was hard to keep the car on the road. When I finally pulled over at a gas station miles away, I called the police. The officers who arrived at the house found no signs of forced entry. The footprints in the snow outside had been partially erased by the wind, and the ones inside the house had dried by the time they arrived. There was no evidence, no explanation for what I had seen. I moved out of that house a month later, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, in my new apartment, I find myself double-checking the locks and windows every night. Sometimes I wonder, who or what was in my house that night? And why did they leave without harming me? Would you have stayed in that house? Or would you have run like I did? Story: the fake police encounter. Berlin is a city that never truly sleeps. Its streets, a mix of cobblestone charm and modern bustle, feel alive even late into the night. But when the crowds thin and the neon lights cast eerie shadows, the city can take on a different, more sinister tone. For one man, a quick late-night errand turned into a harrowing experience that he'll never forget. It was around 3 a.m. on a bitterly cold November night. The kind of cold that nips at your fingers and makes you wish you'd stayed in bed. I'd been lounging at home, chatting with friends online, and had just realized I was out of snacks. A catastrophic end to any gaming session. I decided to brave the chill for a quick trip to the corner shop, a small, dimly lit convenience store just a few blocks away. Berlin at night can feel desolate, but not dangerous. I had walked these streets hundreds of times, always confident in the city's quiet order. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the streets had shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. As I lit a small joint to warm myself against the cold, a rare indulgence on a public street, I noticed a group of men standing at the corner up ahead. They were huddled together, their breaths forming clouds in the frosty air. There was nothing particularly unusual about them at first glance, but the way their eyes followed me as I approached sent a faint shiver down my spine. I told myself not to overthink it. Groups of men often loitered in this part of town, especially late at night. Still, as I passed, I could feel their gazes burning into my back. My heart quickened slightly, but I kept walking, head down, focusing on the flickering neon sign of the shop just ahead. Then I heard it, a sharp voice cutting through the stillness. Routine ID check. Show me your identification. I froze mid-step, the words hitting me like a slap. My mind raced. An ID check? At this hour? On this empty street? Turning slowly, I saw two of the men approaching me, their expressions stern but casual. "We're undercover police," one of them said, pulling a badge from his pocket. The badge was small and flashed briefly in the dim light, giving me no time to study it. The others hung back, watching, their faces unreadable. "Smoking weed in public is illegal. You know," the man continued, his tone accusatory. I stammered a reply, my voice shaky. I wasn't aware. "I'm sorry. Let's see what's in your pockets," the man demanded, his voice sharp now. Alarm bells were ringing in my head. Something felt off. The badge didn't look quite right, too shiny, too perfect. And undercover cops? They wouldn't call out so publicly, would they? Still, the rational part of me argued, what if they really are police? What if I refuse and make things worse? My thoughts were a whirlwind of panic. One of the men stepped closer, his pupils wide and black, glinting in the faint light. His grin was smug, predatory. "Let's go," he said, motioning for me to empty my pockets. I hesitated, reaching into my coat to pull out harmless items, a pack of gum, a lighter. I prayed they wouldn't press further, but the leader wasn't satisfied. "Your wallet," he said, his tone now a command. I froze again, my heart sinking. My wallet. I remembered the cash tucked inside, 300 euros from tips I hadn't yet deposited. Losing that money would crush me financially, but something deeper gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the cash. It was about the way they circled me like wolves, their voices low and taunting. That's when I saw it. a glint of metal tucked into the waistband of the man's jeans. A gun. My panic hit a breaking point. I could feel my legs trembling, my breath catching in my throat. I needed to think fast. Fighting was out of the question. There were too many of them. Running? Not an option with their proximity. And then, like a flash of lightning, an idea struck me. I cleared my throat, straightened my back, and in the thickest Russian accent I could muster, I said, "I'm meeting my friends. Russians. They're coming soon." The leader paused, his grin faltering for a split second. I caught a flicker of confusion in his eyes. The others exchanged glances, muttering quietly among themselves. Russians. The fear of Russian gangs was a well-known undercurrent in this area. They were notorious, their reputation enough to make even the most hardened criminals think twice. The leader tried to maintain his composure. "Your friends." "Huh," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had moments ago. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Yes, big guys. Very protective." The group fell silent, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. The leader's eyes darted between me and the street, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed, gesturing toward the shop. "Fine, buy us something to drink, and we'll forget this ever happened." Relief washed over me, but I hid it well. "Of course," I said, nodding quickly. We walked together into the store, the fluorescent lights feeling harsher than ever. They grabbed a six-pack of soda, and I paid, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the bills. As we stepped back outside, I held my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But to my astonishment, they simply walked away, disappearing into the shadows without another word. I stood there for a moment, stunned, the adrenaline still coursed through my veins, my mind racing with what-ifs. What if they hadn't believed me? What if I'd handed over my wallet? What if they decided to do more than just intimidate me? The cold air bit at my cheeks as I finally made my way home, clutching my coat tightly around me. I couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on me, even after I locked the door behind me. That night, I learned a lesson I wouldn't soon forget. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. But as I would soon find out, danger doesn't always vanish when you step inside your home. Sometimes, it's waiting just outside your door, biding its time, listening, watching. Story. The flute in the forest. Would you explore a dark forest at 3 a.m., knowing it's infamous for tragic deaths? Join us at Wolf Tells as we follow two daring explorers who encounter something far worse than they imagined. Like and subscribe for more harrowing tales. The idea had been mine. Clarissa and I had been dating for a few months, and she was still learning how far I was willing to push for a thrill. Midnight adventures, urban exploration, ghost hunts. I lived for that rush of adrenaline when fear brushed against my curiosity. When I suggested a midnight hike through Greystone Forest, she hesitated. "Isn't that the place with all the creepy stories?" she asked, scrolling through the search results on her phone. "Exactly," I said with a grin. "Come on, how many people get the chance to say they faced their fears and survived? Besides, it's just a bunch of old legends." Clarissa frowned, clearly not convinced. "What about the woman with the flute? They never found the guy who killed her, right? People say they still hear her music." "Urban legend," I assured her. "Probably some local kids trying to scare people off. You'll be fine. I'll be with you the whole time." Reluctantly, she agreed, and so we found ourselves pulling into the small dirt parking lot at the edge of Greystone Forest at 2:48 a.m. The air was colder than I'd expected. Clarissa zipped her jacket up to her chin, her flashlight already on as she scanned the tree line. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" "It's just a walk," I said, grabbing my own flashlight and locking the truck. "If it gets too creepy, we'll turn back. Deal?" She nodded hesitantly, but I could tell she was already on edge. The trailhead was narrow, framed by towering trees that swayed gently in the night breeze. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. I led the way, trying to keep the mood light. "You know, they say this forest has been haunted for decades. A lot of people went missing here back in the 1970s. Some say they ran into the wrong crowd. Others blame wild animals. But the flute story, that one's my favorite. Stop, Clarissa muttered, gripping my arm. I don't want to hear it. I chuckled. Fine, fine. No ghost stories. Just enjoy the fresh air. But even I couldn't deny the strange atmosphere of the forest. The further we walked, the quieter it became. The chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Clarissa stopped suddenly. Do you hear that? I paused, tilting my head to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then, faint and distant, came a single, high-pitched note. At first, I thought it was the wind, whistling through the trees. But the sound continued, growing steadier and more melodic. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably the sound of a flute. Clarissa's grip on my arm tightened. I thought you said this place wasn't really haunted. It's probably someone messing around, I said, though the unease in my chest told a different story. A camper or something. Who camps in a forest at 3 in the morning? She had a point. The melody grew louder as we continued along the trail. It was hauntingly beautiful, each note piercing the silence like a knife. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like it was coming from one direction. It seemed to echo from all around us, as if the forest itself were playing. Clarissa stopped again, this time pulling me back. I don't like this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Let's go back. Just a little further, I urged, though I was starting to second-guess myself. I want to see who's playing. Her eyes widened. Why? What if it's, I don't know, something we don't want to see? Come on, don't you want to know what's out here? No, she said flatly, but I was already moving forward. The melody continued to grow louder, more complex, as if whoever, or whatever, was playing had drawn closer. The trail widened into a small clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Hello? I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The flute music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Clarissa began muttering under her breath, a quiet prayer I couldn't quite make out. Her flashlight shook in her hands, the beam darting wildly across the clearing. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible against the dark trees. But as it moved into the moonlight, my breath caught in my throat. It was massive, hunched over like a predator stalking its prey. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in jagged, claw-like appendages. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was a pale, featureless void, except for 2 pinpricks of light where eyes should have been. Clarissa let out a strangled scream, and the thing bolted, disappearing into the shadows with impossible speed. Run, I shouted, grabbing her arm. We stumbled back onto the trail, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we ran. The flute music resumed, louder and more chaotic, as if mocking our fear. My lungs burned as we sprinted through the forest, the melody chasing us like a predator. It was everywhere, surrounding us, growing so loud that I could feel it vibrating in my chest. Clarissa tripped, nearly dragging me down with her. I hauled her to her feet, the terror in her eyes mirroring my own. We're almost there, I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The trees thinned, and the faint outline of the parking lot came into view. I fumbled with my keys as we reached the truck, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped them twice. The music reached a deafening crescendo as we climbed inside, slamming the doors shut. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a moment, we just sat there, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in unison. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I told you, Clarissa said finally, her voice shaky. I told you we shouldn't have come. We didn't speak on the drive back, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next day, I scoured the internet for any explanation, anything that could make sense of what we'd experienced. The stories were endless. People vanishing, strange lights, sightings of creatures like the one we'd seen, and, of course, the flute, but there was no definitive answer, no evidence, no photos, nothing concrete. To this day, I still hear the melody in my dreams. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear it faintly in the distance, beckoning me back to the forest. Story: The Home Depot Encounter. What would you do if a routine trip to buy tools turned into a harrowing game of cat and mouse? Imagine this. You're walking through the aisles of a hardware store, browsing in peace, when you notice someone watching you, not just glancing in your direction, but following your every move. At first, you shrug it off as a coincidence. Maybe they're just shopping, like you. But then they start getting closer. They follow you from aisle to aisle, their footsteps echoing just a little too closely behind yours. They try to talk to you, their tone unsettling. When you leave, you think you're free, but they're waiting for you in the parking lot. This is exactly what happened to me during a quiet evening at Home Depot. A simple errand turned into a nightmare, one that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. By the time I realized how dangerous the situation was, it was almost too late. Would you have recognized the signs in time? It was a Friday evening, and I was feeling ambitious. I had spent weeks putting off a few home projects, replacing a leaky faucet, fixing a creaky cabinet door, and finally installing shelves in my garage. That night, I decided it was time to tackle my growing to-do list. Home Depot was the logical choice. It was close to my house, open late, and stocked with everything I needed. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how quiet it was. Most of the spaces were empty, and the orange glow of the store's sign illuminated the dark lot. Inside, the atmosphere was similarly calm. A few employees wandered the aisles, restocking shelves or assisting the handful of customers who were still shopping. I grabbed a cart and began making my way through the store, checking off items from my mental list. I started in the plumbing section, scanning the rows of fittings and pipes for the parts one needed for my sink. That's when I noticed him. At first, it was just a peripheral awareness, a man lingering at the far end of the aisle, seemingly browsing. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 5 inches, wearing a gray hoodie and ripped jeans. His hair was unkempt, and his scruffy beard looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. I thought nothing of it at first. After all, it was a public store, and he had every right to be there. But then, as I moved to the hardware section, he followed. By the time I reached the aisle with the power tools, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The man was there again, standing at the opposite end, pretending to examine a drill set. Our eyes met briefly, and he nodded at me. "Hey," he said, his voice gruff. "Hey," I replied curtly, trying not to engage. "Got a second?" he asked, taking a step closer. My stomach tightened. "What's up?" He scratched the back of his neck, looking sheepish. "You think you could lend me some money? Just a few bucks to get something to eat?" I hesitated. The request felt strange, not just because he was asking for money in a hardware store, but because of the way he was looking at me, his eyes darting to the cart I was pushing, then back to me. "Sorry, man, I don't have any cash on me," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. He frowned, muttered something under his breath, and walked away, relieved. I turned back to my shopping, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. After that interaction, I made an effort to avoid him. I zigzagged through the store, moving to random aisles to throw him off. I even left my cart behind at one point, thinking it would make me harder to track. For a while, it seemed to work. I didn't see him again as I made my way to the checkout lanes. But just as I was paying for my items, I caught a glimpse of him in the corner of the store, standing near the restrooms. He wasn't shopping or browsing anymore. He was just standing there, watching me. I hurried through the transaction, my pulse quickening. "It's nothing," I told myself as I grabbed my bags and headed for the exit. "He's just a weird guy. It's over." I was wrong. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief. The parking lot was still mostly empty, and my car was parked near the entrance. But as I approached my car, I saw him again. He was standing a few rows away, leaning casually against a light pole. My pace quickened. My keys were already in my hand, and I unlocked the car as I approached. I didn't look at him. hoping he wouldn't follow. But as I opened the driver's side door and started loading my bags into the passenger seat, I heard footsteps. "Hey," he called out. I turned, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Can I help you?" He was walking toward me now, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. "Look, I just need a little help. Man, a ride, maybe, or some money. Anything you can spare." "I'm sorry," I said, stepping back toward my car. "I can't help you." His expression darkened. "Come on," he said, his tone sharper now. "Don't be like that." Before I could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing the edge of my car door. "Get out of the car," he demanded, his voice low and menacing. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Let go," I shouted, shoving the door closed as hard as I could. The man stumbled back, cursing under his breath. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one swift motion. My hands fumbled as I started the engine, but the roar of the car brought a rush of relief. The man ran to the passenger side, trying to open the door. When that didn't work, he began pounding on the window. "Open the door," he yelled. I didn't think. I just acted, throwing the car into reverse. I backed out of the parking space as quickly as I could, narrowly avoiding another car. The man chased after me, but I didn't stop. As I sped toward the exit, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing in the middle of the lot, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back home, my hands still shaking as I pulled into the driveway. The next day, I reported the incident to the store manager and the local police. They assured me they would review the security footage and keep an eye out for the man. But that didn't ease my nerves. For weeks, I found myself looking over my shoulder every time I left the house. Every shadow, every stranger in a parking lot felt like a potential threat. I never went back to that Home Depot. Even now, I can't step into a hardware store without feeling a twinge of anxiety. The memory of that man, his cold stare, his aggressive demeanor, haunts me. What would you have done in my place? Would you have recognized the danger in time? Or would you have hesitated? I'll never know what might have happened if I hadn't gotten away. But one thing is certain, I'll never let my guard down again. Story: The Lost Hiker. Imagine a quiet hike through the woods with your classmates, a chance to escape the noise of school. Breathe fresh air, and feel the crunch of leaves under your boots. You're surrounded by towering trees, the sunlight filtering through their branches, and the sound of distant birdsong. But then you fall behind, just for a moment. You stop to tie your shoe, expecting to catch up in seconds. But when you look up, the group is gone, the trail splits, and you're not sure which path they took. You start walking, calling out for your friends, but no one answers. Then you see him. At first, he's just a figure in the distance, a man with long black hair and a green shirt, standing off the trail. You call out to him, hoping for help, but instead of answering, he steps behind a tree and vanishes. The woods feel quieter now, the air heavier. When you see him again, closer this time, he's watching you from behind another tree. What would you do if a peaceful hike turned into a desperate escape from someone or something that wanted to catch you? It was supposed to be a fun day. Our class had been looking forward to this field trip for weeks, a hiking adventure in a sprawling nature reserve just outside of town. The trip promised fresh air, scenic views, and a chance to escape the monotony of the classroom. When we arrived, our teacher, Mr. Johnson, gathered us at the trailhead. "Stay together," he said firmly, his voice carrying over the chatter of excited students. "The woods are bigger than they look, and it's easy to get lost. Keep up with the group, and don't wander off." We nodded dutifully, though most of us were too distracted by the towering trees and the promise of adventure to pay much attention. The hike started off easy. The trail was wide and well-maintained, winding gently through the forest. Mr. Johnson led the way, with about 15 of us trailing behind him. I stuck close to my friends at first, enjoying the light-hearted banter and the occasional challenge to race up small hills. But as the trail grew steeper and narrower, the group began to spread out. Some of the faster students surged ahead, while others lingered behind to snap photos or catch their breath. It happened so quickly. One moment, I was walking with a few friends, and the next, I was alone. I had stopped to tie my shoe, letting my friends go ahead. I'll catch up, I called after them, not thinking much of it. When I stood up again, the trail ahead was empty. The laughter and voices of my classmates had faded, swallowed by the dense trees. "Hey, wait up," I shouted, jogging forward. But the trail split into 3 paths, and I froze. Which way had they gone? I chose the middle path, hoping it was the right one. My footsteps crunched against the leaves as I hurried along, calling out every few minutes, "Mr. Johnson? Emily? Anyone?" The woods grew quieter the farther I went. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, and the air felt colder. Then I saw him. At first, I thought he was a fellow hiker. A man stood about 50 feet off the trail, his back to me. He had long, dark hair that fell past his shoulders, and he was wearing a green shirt and jeans. Relief washed over me. "Hey," I called, waving. "I think I'm lost. Have you seen a group of kids come through here?" He didn't move. "Hello?" I tried again, stepping closer. That's when he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His expression was blank, almost unnatural, and his eyes seemed wrong. Before I could say anything else, he stepped behind a tree and disappeared. Something about the encounter unsettled me, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just shy or didn't hear me. I kept walking, moving faster now, determined to catch up with my class. But as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw him again. This time, he was closer, standing partially hidden behind a tree, his head tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. "Can you help me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, vanishing once again. My chest tightened. The woods felt darker now, the silence oppressive. I turned and started walking faster, my footsteps loud in the stillness. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The first time I heard the footsteps, I froze. They were faint, barely audible over the rustle of leaves. But they were there, slow, deliberate, and keeping pace with me. I spun around, scanning the trees. "Who's there?" I shouted. No response. I started walking again, my pace quickening. The footsteps followed. Panic set in. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short gasps. The trail twisted and turned, but I barely noticed. My focus fixed on putting as much distance as possible between me and the sound. But then, ahead of me, he appeared again. He was standing in the middle of the trail, his face partially obscured by his hair. This time, there was no mistaking his intent. His eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled a wide, unsettling grin that sent shivers down my spine. Then he started running. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted down the trail, branches scratching at my arms and face. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding against the ground, getting closer with each passing second. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate attempt to lose him. The thick brush tore at my clothes, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my lungs burning from the effort. Every time I dared to look back, he was there, ducking behind trees, his green shirt a flash of color in the otherwise drab woods. At one point, I thought I had lost him. The woods were silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing. But then I heard it, a low, eerie whistle, coming from somewhere to my left. The whistle grew louder, more insistent. As I pushed forward, I had no idea where I was or if I was even heading in the right direction. Just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw it, the trailhead. It was like a beacon of hope, the wide dirt path leading back to the school parking lot, summoning the last of my strength. I sprinted toward it. When I finally emerged from the woods, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. My classmates were gathered near the buses, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. "Where have you been?" Emily asked when she saw me. "We thought you ditched." I tried to explain what had happened, but no one seemed to believe me. Maybe it was just a ranger or something, Mr. Johnson said dismissively, but I knew the truth. That man wasn't a ranger. He wasn't anyone who belonged in those woods. And the way he had followed me, the way he had smiled, it wasn't normal. Even now, years later, I can still see his face when I close my eyes. Would you have kept running? Or would you have tried to confront him? Story: the man at the sliding glass door. What would you do if, while home alone, a stranger suddenly appeared at your back door, staring at you through the glass with a look that sent chills down your spine? It was supposed to be a quiet evening. I had the house to myself for the weekend, and the solitude was a welcome break. I had just settled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, with a movie playing in the background. The rain outside added to the cozy atmosphere, tapping lightly against the windows. Then came the first knock. It was faint, almost hesitant, at the front door. My heart skipped, but I dismissed it as a package delivery or maybe even a neighbor. When I checked, no one was there. Minutes later, I heard it again, footsteps this time, but they weren't at the front door. They were on the back deck. I froze, my eyes darting to the sliding glass door. There, in the gap of the blinds, was a man, bald, wearing a black jacket, and standing completely still. He stared directly at me. Would you have stayed calm? Or would the fear have consumed you? It had been a long week, and I was looking forward to the rare chance to have the house to myself. My parents had left town for the weekend to attend a wedding, and I'd opted to stay behind. The house felt unusually quiet without the usual hustle and bustle of my family. I spent most of the day lounging around, catching up on a show I'd been meaning to watch, and enjoying the kind of lazy freedom that only comes with being alone. By nightfall, the rain had started. It was light at first, barely more than a drizzle, but it quickly turned into a steady downpour. The rhythmic sound of raindrops against the roof and windows was oddly soothing. I decided to call it an early night, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a warm cup of tea. I left the TV on for background noise, the glow of the screen casting soft shadows across the living room. It was peaceful, too peaceful, perhaps. The knock came around 9 p.m., faint but clear. At first, I thought it might be the rain playing tricks on me, but then it came again, a soft, deliberate rap at the front door. I sat up, the blanket sliding off my shoulders. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I shook off the unease. It was probably a package delivery, I told myself, or maybe one of the neighbors needed something. Grabbing my phone, I walked to the front door. The porch light was on, but when I peeked through the peephole, there was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, peering out into the rain-soaked night. The porch was empty, the driveway deserted. A chill ran down my spine as I closed the door and locked it. I had barely sat back down on the couch when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the back deck. This time, there was no mistaking it. The wooden planks creaked under the weight of someone moving slowly, deliberately. My blood ran cold. The sliding glass door was partially obscured by blinds, but there was a small gap where they didn't quite meet. My eyes were drawn to that gap, and that's when I saw him. A bald man in a black jacket stood just outside the glass, staring directly at me. His expression was blank, almost unnervingly calm. I froze, my mind racing. He didn't knock, didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, the man moved. He reached out and tried the handle of the sliding door. It rattled slightly, but it didn't budge. It was locked. My heart pounded in my chest as I slid off the couch, crouching low and out of sight. I grabbed my phone and hurried toward the hallway, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring, but I could barely hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat. I explained the situation, whispering as I crept toward the bathroom at the end of the hall. As I locked the bathroom door behind me, the sound of banging echoed through the house. The man was no longer trying to be subtle. The bangs against the sliding door grew louder, more forceful, until finally, I heard the sharp crack of glass breaking. My stomach dropped. He was inside. I pressed myself against the bathroom wall, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The operator was still on the line, assuring me that police were on their way, but their words felt distant. I heard his footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the living room. He was searching for something, or someone. Then, The footsteps stopped. They were right outside the bathroom door. The doorknob jiggled, and my breath caught in my throat. The man banged on the door, hard enough to make it rattle in its frame. My phone suddenly went silent. The battery had died. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I grabbed the towels hanging on the rack and stuffed them under the door, trying to muffle any sound I might make. But then I remembered. My parents kept a baseball bat in the hallway closet. If I could just get to it, I might stand a chance. Summoning every ounce of courage, I unlocked the bathroom door and dashed into the hallway. The man spotted me instantly. His eyes locked onto mine, and he lunged forward, reaching for me. I grabbed the bat and swung it wildly, the metal connecting with his arm. He let out a grunt of pain, but it didn't slow him down. I bolted back into the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it again. The bat was still in my hands, my only defense. The man began pounding on the door with renewed fury. I could hear him muttering under his breath, though I couldn't make out the words. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Red and blue lights flashed through the bathroom window, followed by the sound of shouting. "Put your hands where we can see them." I heard a scuffle, the sound of heavy boots on the floor, and then silence. When the police knocked on the bathroom door, I hesitated, my body still frozen in fear. It wasn't until they identified themselves again that I finally unlocked the door. The man was already in handcuffs, being led out to a patrol car. One of the officers explained that he had been carrying a baseball bat and a knife, though they couldn't say what his intentions had been. I stayed with a friend that night, unable to face the thought of returning home alone. Even now, weeks later, the memory of that man, his blank expression, his silent determination, haunts me. What would he have done if the police hadn't arrived in time? The thought keeps me up at night, every creak of the house making my heart race. Would you have been able to keep your composure, or would the fear have consumed you? Story: the motel room intruder. Imagine this. You're trapped in a blizzard, snow piling high around your car, and visibility reduced to nothing but a white haze. The highway is deserted, and the nearest gas station is miles behind you. Just when you think the storm will consume you, a flickering neon sign appears in the distance. A motel? Relieved, you pull into the lot and check into a room. It's nothing fancy, peeling wallpaper, a faint smell of mildew, but it's warm, and it's safe. Or so you think. That night, the howling wind outside is replaced by another sound, a faint clicking noise, like someone fiddling with your door. You freeze, your breath caught in your throat. Looking through the peephole, you see a man standing outside, his face shadowed by the dim hallway light. He's trying to break in. This is the story of how an unexpected night in a secluded motel turned into a waking nightmare. A story that still makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. I hadn't planned on staying at a motel that night. The storm caught me off guard, rolling in faster than the weather reports had predicted. One moment, the road was clear, and the next, snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. I was driving through the outskirts of a rural area, the kind of place where the nearest town could be 20 miles away. The highway, which had been bustling with traffic earlier, was eerily empty now. The snow was relentless, covering the road in a thick layer of ice and slush. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and my tires slipped more than once. When I saw the neon sign for a Sunny Pines Motel flickering in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. It wasn't much, but it was better than freezing in my car overnight. I pulled into the parking lot, which was barely visible under the accumulating snow. The building itself was run down, with cracked windows and a faded sign hanging above the front office. But in that moment, I didn't care. The front office was as shabby as the exterior, dimly lit, with old furniture and a counter that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Behind the counter was an older man with a grizzled beard, wearing a flannel shirt and an expression of mild disinterest. "Got a room?" I asked, my voice shaking from the cold. "Cash or card?" he replied, not looking up from the TV playing behind him. "Card," I said, pulling out my wallet. The man handed me a room key without much ceremony. "Room 12, around the back." I thanked him and headed back into the storm. The snow was up to my ankles by the time I reached my car, and it took a few attempts to back it into the narrow spot near my room. Room 12 was on the far side of the motel, away from the main office. It looked like no one else was staying there. The other rooms were dark, their curtains drawn tightly shut. When I stepped into the room, it was exactly what I expected. Old carpet, peeling wallpaper, and a heater that rattled when I turned it on. But it was warm, and it was dry. I spent the first hour trying to relax. I unpacked a few things, turned on the TV, and ate the last of the snacks I had brought with me. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the heater and the faint hum of the wind outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The locks on the door seemed flimsy, a simple knob lock and a chain that looked like it could snap with enough force. I double-checked them anyway, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I climbed into bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the neon sign outside. The storm was still raging, the wind howling like a living thing. Then I heard it, a faint clicking noise, like someone jiggling the doorknob. My heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the sound of the storm. There it was again, a deliberate, metallic sound, as if someone was trying to pick the lock. I slipped out of bed, moving as quietly as possible. My bare feet sank into the cold carpet as I crept toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw him. A man was standing just outside my door, his figure partially obscured by the dim hallway light. He was wearing a dark jacket, and his head was tilted downward, as if concentrating on the lock. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something deliberate about the way he moved, like he had done this before. My mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My first instinct was to call the front desk, but when I reached for the phone, I found it wasn't working. The man tried the knob again, harder this time. The chain rattled against the frame, and I could hear his breathing now, deep, steady, and unnervingly calm. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and wait for him to get in. I grabbed the chair from the desk and wedged it under the doorknob, reinforcing the flimsy lock as best I could. The man must have heard me, because he paused. For a moment, there was complete silence, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, he slammed his body against the door. The impact was so forceful that the chain rattled loose, and the chair groaned under the pressure. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to think of a plan. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. The man didn't respond. He slammed against the door again, harder this time, just as I thought the door would give way. The sound of a car engine echoed through the parking lot. The man froze, his head turning toward the window. Then, without a word, he walked away. I waited several minutes before daring to move. When I finally peeked through the curtain, I saw nothing but snow and darkness. The man was gone. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining what had happened as clearly as I could. When the officers arrived, they searched the property but found no sign of the man. The motel staff claimed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. "It's probably just some drifter," one of the officers said, though his tone wasn't reassuring. "These places attract all kinds of people." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. When morning came, I checked out as quickly as I could, grateful to leave the motel behind. But the memory of that night has stayed with me. I still wonder who the man was, what his intentions were, and why he chose my room. Would you have been able to sleep after something like that? Or would the fear follow you, just like it follows me? Story: The Mysterious Flyers. What would you do if a routine delivery turned into a brush with something unexplainable? Imagine this. You're working a regular shift, dropping off flyers at houses like you've done hundreds of times before. Most of the stops are uneventful, ordinary houses with nothing remarkable about them. But then you reach a house that feels wrong. The windows are dark, the yard overgrown, and the air around it seems unnaturally still. As you approach the front door, you can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is watching you. Just as you're about to leave, a woman calls out from an upstairs window, her voice strangely calm and inviting. But something about her doesn't sit right. When you look closer, you realize her shadow isn't behaving the way it should. And behind her, partially obscured by the curtain, is a figure you didn't notice before. Would you go inside? Would you trust your instincts and leave? This is the story of how a routine task led me to one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. A house that I still can't get out of my head. Years later, it started as just another day on the job. I worked part-time as a delivery driver for a local print shop, and my assignments were usually boring but easy. Most of the time, it involved dropping off promotional materials like menus, coupons, or flyers to residential neighborhoods. That day, I had been assigned to deliver real estate flyers for an open house. The list of addresses was long, but the job was straightforward. Walk up to each house, leave a flyer on the door, and move on. The first half of my route was uneventful. I worked my way through neatly manicured suburbs, passing rows of identical houses with trimmed hedges and perfectly mowed lawns. Occasionally, a dog would bark or a homeowner would wave, but for the most part, I was left alone. By late afternoon, I reached the last neighborhood on my list. The vibe here was different. The houses were older, their paint peeling, and the yards overgrown with weeds. It was quieter, too eerily so. The occasional car passed by, but there were no kids playing outside, no people tending their gardens. I flipped through the stack of flyers, checking the next address, 247 Oak Ridge Lane. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just another house. One more stop before I could call it a day. As I turned onto Oak Ridge Lane, I immediately spotted the house. It stood at the very end of the cul-de-sac, partially hidden behind a cluster of gnarled oak trees. The driveway was cracked and uneven, and the yard was a tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs. The house itself was 2 stories tall. Its once white paint faded to a dull gray. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, and the mailbox hung crookedly on its post. I parked my car at the curb and grabbed a flyer from the passenger seat. As I walked up the cracked pathway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air around the house felt wrong. It was heavy and still, as if the usual sounds of the neighborhood, birds chirping, leaves rustling, had been muted. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The front door was old and weathered, its paint peeling in long strips. The doorbell looked like it hadn't worked in years, so I leaned forward to wedge the flyer into the doorframe. That's when I heard it. "Wait, don't go." The voice startled me, making me drop the flyer. It was a woman's voice, soft and calm, but with an edge of urgency. I looked up and saw her leaning out of a second-story window. She was in her mid-30s, with long dark hair that framed her pale face. She was smiling, but something about her expression felt off, like it was too practiced, too controlled. "Are you leaving something for me?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Yeah," I said, bending down to pick up the flyer. "Just a delivery." Her smile widened. "Why don't you bring it inside? It'll blow away if you leave it out there." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to decline. "That's okay," I said quickly. "I'll just leave it here on the porch." Her smile faltered for a moment, and then she leaned forward slightly. "Are you sure? It's no trouble. Come on in." That's when I noticed it, the light from the room behind her spilling out into the evening. But her shadow wasn't there. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. The light from the room was bright, illuminating the walls and the furniture behind her. But where her shadow should have been, there was nothing, just an empty patch of wall. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. As I tried to process what I was seeing, I noticed something else. Behind her, partially hidden by the curtain, was the outline of another figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his eyes on me. The woman must have noticed my expression because her tone shifted. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "No," I said quickly, stepping backward. I need to finish my route." I placed the flyer on the porch and turned to leave, my heart racing. "Wait," she called again, her voice more urgent. Please, don't go. I didn't stop. As I walked back to my car, I could feel the weight of their eyes on me. I resisted the urge to look back, afraid of what I might see. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, relief washing over me as the house disappeared from view. But as I drove down the quiet street, I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach dropped. There, in the second-story window, was the man. He was standing in the exact same spot, staring directly at me. His face was pale, and his eyes were dark, unblinking. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's too perfect smile, the shadowless light, and the man's face in the window. The next day, I told my boss about the incident. He listened patiently, then suggested I report it to the police. When I did, the officers were polite but skeptical. It's probably just a misunderstanding, one of them said. We'll check it out, but there's nothing illegal about a strange house. A week later, I got a call from one of the officers. We visited the house, he said. The occupants claimed they didn't speak to anyone that day. In fact, they said they'd been out of town for weeks. My blood ran cold. To this day, I don't know what happened at 247 Oak Ridge Lane. Was it a prank? A coincidence? Or was it something far more sinister? The house still stands at the end of the cul-de-sac, its windows dark and its yard overgrown. I've driven past it a few times since then, but I've never had the courage to stop. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone inside. Would I have made it out? Or would I have joined the shadows that didn't move? What would you have done in my place? Story: the persistent follower. Late-night walks have a peculiar kind of solitude, comforting yet unsettling. The streets are quiet, the world seemingly asleep, and every sound feels amplified against the stillness. For one man, what started as a peaceful stroll home turned into a waking nightmare when he realized he wasn't alone. It was a little past 10 p.m. when I left the cafe where I'd been working late. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk away, and the streets of my neighborhood were typically safe. The air was cool, crisp, and the orange glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and began the familiar trek home, listening to the rhythmic crunch of my boots against the pavement. At first, everything seemed normal. Quiet houses, empty streets, a dog barking faintly in the distance. And then I noticed him. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a figure about 20 feet behind me. I glanced back casually, not wanting to seem paranoid. A man, average height, average build, wearing a dark jacket. Nothing unusual. I told myself it was nothing, just someone else heading home, walking the same route. Coincidence. But as I continued, something gnawed at the back of my mind. His footsteps mirrored mine. When I slowed, he slowed. When I quickened my pace, so did he. The first jolt of fear struck me when I turned onto a quieter street, hoping to lose him. The sound of his boots on the pavement followed me like an echo. I risked another glance over my shoulder. He was still there. My heart began to race. I turned again, this time onto a side street I didn't usually take, winding between rows of darkened houses. I glanced back again. He was still there. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath quickening. Rational thoughts battled with the growing panic in my mind. Maybe he lives here. Maybe he's just going the same way. But every fiber of my being screamed otherwise. I decided to test him, reaching an intersection. I crossed the street abruptly, taking an exaggerated diagonal path. I didn't even make it halfway across before I heard it, the sharp sound of his boots following my lead. He crossed the street, too, keeping the same distance behind me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It wasn't a coincidence anymore. By now, I was no longer walking. I was pacing, my movements jerky and frantic. I turned down another unfamiliar street, its emptiness making me feel more exposed than ever. A street lamp buzzed and flickered above me, casting an eerie glow. I dared another glance over my shoulder. He was closer now. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shadowed outline of his figure. But his posture, there was something deliberate about it, something predatory. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to unlock it. The screen glowed brightly in the darkness, illuminating my face. I opened the dialer, but my mind went blank. Who could I call? What could I even say? The sound of his footsteps grew louder. I panicked, shoving my phone back into my pocket and breaking into a brisk jog. Ahead of me was a 24-hour convenience store, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. The thought of being around other people, even just a cashier, felt like a lifeline. I pushed through the glass doors, the sharp jingle of the bell signaling my entrance. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and unwelcoming, but I didn't care. I went straight to one of the aisles, pretending to browse, my eyes darting toward the door. And then I saw him. He was standing just outside the store, his face partially obscured by shadows. For the first time, I got a clear look at him, or at least his eyes. They were fixed on me, unblinking, his head tilted slightly, as if he were studying me, trying to decide what to do next. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the shelf in front of me. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the cashier could hear it. He didn't move. The glass door reflected his silhouette perfectly, a dark shape against the pale glow of the streetlights outside. He wasn't pacing or fidgeting. He was just standing there, watching. I couldn't stay here forever. I needed to act. I grabbed a random drink from the shelf and approached the counter, my legs shaky beneath me. The cashier barely looked up from his phone as he rang me up. I kept glancing over my shoulder, watching the man through the glass. My mind raced with possibilities. What would happen if I walked out? Would he follow me again? Would he do more than just follow this time? The cashier handed me my change, and I realized I had no plan. None. I had to leave. I had to face him, clutching the bottle tightly in one hand. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air was colder now, biting at my skin. He was gone. I spun around, searching the street, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps echoing on the pavement. No shadow lingering under the street lamps. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I didn't waste another second. I bolted, sprinting the last few blocks to my apartment. The streetlights blurred around me as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with every bolt and chain I had. I stood there in the dark, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. My legs were trembling, my body drenched in cold sweat. For hours, I sat by the window, staring out at the street below, half expecting to see him standing there again, waiting. But the street remained empty. I never saw him again, but the fear lingered. Even now, I can't walk home alone at night without looking over my shoulder. I can't hear footsteps behind me without feeling that familiar dread creeping in. Was he just some random man? A harmless stranger who happened to be walking the same route? Or was he something else? Something darker? I'll never know. Story: The Porch Intruder. Imagine hearing a voice outside your room in the dead of night. It's faint at first, barely audible through the stillness. You try to tell yourself it's nothing, maybe a passing car, the wind brushing against the walls. But then it grows louder, more persistent, and suddenly, you realize it's not just a noise. It's a voice, and it's coming from your porch. It had been a quiet evening, the kind where the silence feels thicker than usual. I had just returned home from a family outing, a Thanksgiving dinner, and a movie. The night air was crisp, a thin layer of frost coating the driveway as I parked my car and made my way inside. My apartment was tucked in the back of a divided house, with its own little porch that led directly into my kitchen. After a long day, I craved nothing more than to unwind. I settled into my bedroom, which, unfortunately, had a strange architectural quirk, a door that led directly onto the porch. The door had been blocked by my dresser since I moved in, but its presence always unnerved me slightly. What was it even for? Who thought it was a good idea to have a bedroom open to an exterior space? Shrugging off the thought, I turned to my work, spending the next 30 minutes at my desk, answering emails and tying up loose ends from the day. The house was silent except for the soft hum of my laptop, and then I heard it. At first, it was faint, like a whisper carried on the breeze. A man's voice, low and continuous, barely distinguishable through the walls. I paused, tilting my head toward the sound. Was it my upstairs neighbor? His bedroom was directly above mine, but I'd lived here long enough to know the walls weren't that thin. I'd never heard his voice seep through before. The more I listened, the more certain I became. It wasn't coming from above. It was coming from outside. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, and moved closer to the block door. My heart thudded louder with each step. The voice continued, a steady stream of words, spoken too fast and too low for me to make out. My hand hovered over the dresser, pressing against the wood as if I could feel the vibrations of his words through it. This couldn't be happening. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was someone walking by on the street, or a passerby taking a phone call near my porch. That made sense, didn't it? I crept to my bedroom window, which overlooked the porch from the side. Carefully, I lifted the curtain just enough to peek outside. The porch was bathed in moonlight, its wooden boards gleaming with frost. At first, I saw nothing, and then I did. A man was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the porch. His back was to me, his long, scraggly hair hanging down in uneven clumps. He rocked back and forth slowly, his body swaying in rhythm with his muttering. His voice was steady, like he was reciting something he had memorized. Over and over again, my heart hammered in my chest as I lowered the curtain. My mind raced. Who was this man? How long had he been there? And why was he muttering outside my door? For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen in place, torn between calling the police and confronting him myself. But fear kept me rooted. What if he was dangerous? What if he had a weapon? I tried to rationalize. Maybe he was homeless, looking for a place to stay warm. Maybe he was drunk or high, his muttering just a byproduct of whatever substances he was on. But as I pressed my ear against the door, listening to his words more clearly, I realized something chilling. He wasn't just muttering random nonsense. He was repeating a name. My name. Your name. Your name. Your name. I recoiled, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. How did he know my name? Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But just as I was about to hit call, I stopped. The porch door creaked. My blood ran cold. He was moving. I scrambled back to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see him. He had risen to his feet now, his lanky frame towering in the moonlight. His hands were up, palms facing outward in a strange, almost playful gesture. He turned his head slightly, as if sensing my gaze, and then, in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, he said, "My name is Evan." I let the curtain drop, stepping back as the floor creaked beneath me. Evan? Who was Evan? Why was he here? And how did he know my name? My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of the situation. From the other side of the door, his voice came again, soft and almost sing-song. I know. I'm hiding. Something about the way he said it, like a child playing hide-and-seek, pushed me over the edge. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was reacting. I flung open the bedroom door and stormed down the hallway toward the porch. Fear had been replaced by a surge of adrenaline-fueled anger. How dare he invade my space like this? The kitchen was dark as I yanked open the main door to the porch, ready to confront him. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice echoing into the night. "Get the hell out of here!" But Evan didn't flinch. He turned slowly, his face half hidden in shadow, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you'd see on someone who knew they had the upper hand. I know, he said, his voice still light, almost teasing. "I'm hiding." I grabbed the nearest object, a broom leaning against the wall, and brandished it like a weapon. "Get out, or I swear to God, I'll call the cops." Finally, he raised his hands in mock surrender, taking a slow step back. All right, he said, his tone infuriatingly calm. "I'm leaving." He turned and shuffled off the porch, his movements deliberate and slow, as if he had all the time in the world. I stood there for a long time after he disappeared into the shadows, the broom still clenched in my hands. My body was trembling now, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind a raw, Aching fear. The police came later, taking my statement and promising to patrol the area. But I knew, deep down, that they wouldn't find him. People like Evan didn't just vanish, they lingered, like a shadow you couldn't quite get rid of. From that night on, I double-checked every lock, every window, every possible way someone could get in, but even with the doors bolted and the lights on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Evan was still out there, watching, waiting. But as I would soon learn, Evan wasn't the only one who would blur the lines between fear and paranoia. Sometimes, the terror follows you, step by step, turn by turn, until you can't tell if you're running from a threat or from your own shadow. Story: The Woman in White. There's something about driving alone at night that stirs an ancient, primal fear. The dark trees loom on either side of the road, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. Shadows seem to flicker just beyond the reach of your headlights. And in those moments, the imagination is your worst enemy. It conjures up shapes and figures, whispers and movements, all in the periphery of your vision. But sometimes, it isn't your imagination. I learned this on New Year's Eve last year, a night I'll never forget. Darren's family threw the kind of New Year's Eve parties people looked forward to all year. Their home, nestled deep in the woods outside town, was the perfect venue, isolated enough for loud music and late-night revelry, but still warm and welcoming. I'd been to their place dozens of times before, so the drive there felt routine. I left my house around 7 p.m., the cold December air nipping at my face as I loaded a small gift bag and my jacket into the car. Snow wasn't in the forecast, but the temperature had plummeted in the last few days, making the roads frost-slick and hazardous. The drive took me down a series of winding back roads, each one narrower and darker than the last. Towering trees lined either side, their dense canopies blocking out the already dim twilight. I turned on my high beams, their light carving a feeble path through the oppressive darkness. About halfway there, I noticed something ahead. At first, it was just a pale smudge in the distance, barely distinguishable from the snow-dusted trees. As I drew closer, the shape became clearer. A person, a woman. She stood at the edge of the forest, her figure illuminated in the glow of my headlights. She was tall and unnaturally still, wearing a long white gown that swayed slightly in the breeze. Her hair, dark and stringy, fell past her shoulders, partially obscuring her face. I slowed down, my heart skipping a beat. What was she doing out here, alone in the freezing cold? For a fleeting moment, I considered stopping to check on her, but something about her posture, rigid, almost statuesque, made my skin crawl. As I passed, I glanced at her face, or at least, I tried to. Her features were indistinct, blurred as if I were looking through frosted glass. Her head tilted ever so slightly in my direction, but her gaze remained fixed on the forest behind her. I shuddered and drove on, keeping my eyes firmly on the road ahead. But curiosity, or maybe guilt, got the better of me. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She had turned. Now, she was facing the road, her head tilted again, but this time in my direction. Even from a distance, her stare felt unnerving, invasive, as if it could pierce through the layers of metal and glass separating us. I slammed the mirror upward, unwilling to look at her for another second. My palms were clammy against the steering wheel as I pressed the gas, eager to reach Darren's house and the safety of its glowing windows. Darren greeted me at the door with his usual wide grin, a drink already in hand. The house buzzed with the lively chatter of guests, the clinking of glasses, and the faint hum of festive music. Within minutes, the tension from the drive began to fade. As the hours passed, the memory of the woman on the road became little more than a strange anecdote to share over drinks. Probably just someone from one of the nearby houses. Darren said dismissively when I told him, "It's weird, sure, but not unheard of." The clock struck midnight, and we all gathered around the TV to watch the ball drop. Cheers erupted as we welcomed the new year, glasses raised high in celebration. By the time I left, the crowd had thinned, and the once lively house had settled into a comfortable quiet. It was past 1 a.m. when I slid into the driver's seat, the cold biting at my fingers as I fumbled with the keys. The driveway was deserted, the other cars having long since departed. I was tired but not alarmed. The woods always seemed unnervingly quiet this late at night. As I retraced my route home, the familiar unease began to creep back in. The same dark trees, the same frost-covered road, and then, as if fate were mocking me, my dashboard lit up with a tire pressure warning. "Not now," I muttered, pulling over to check. I stepped out, my breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air, and aimed my phone's flashlight at the tires. All four were shredded. The cuts were deep, jagged, as though made by claws rather than a puncture. My chest tightened. This wasn't normal. This was deliberate. A sudden stillness fell over the forest. The faint rustle of branches and distant chirping of insects ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then came the sound, a twig snapping, sharp and deliberate. "I see you," a voice whispered. It was soft, almost playful, yet it sent ice coursing through my veins. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. She was there. The woman in white stood just beyond the edge of the road, her gown now stained with dark streaks. Her face was clearer now, and what I saw will haunt me forever. Half of her jaw was missing, leaving a gaping maw that stretched into an unnatural grin. Yet somehow, she spoke again. "Can you see me?" I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. Her head tilted in that same unnatural way, her movements disjointed, puppet-like. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The crunch of leaves and twigs behind me told me she was following. The run back to Darren's house was a blur. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel her presence, impossibly close, as if she were brushing against the edges of my mind. When I reached the house, I banged on the door, shouting for Darren. His mother opened it, her eyes wide with alarm as she pulled me inside. "What happened?" she asked, but I couldn't form a coherent response. Safe behind locked doors, I finally managed to explain. Darren and his parents listened, their expressions shifting from concern to disbelief. "We'll call the police," Darren's father said firmly, though his tone betrayed doubt. I spent the night in a guest room, but sleep didn't come easily. At 3:14 a.m., I was jolted awake by a soft tapping. It was coming from the second-story window. I froze, my heart hammering as the tapping grew louder. Then came the voice. Her voice. "I see you." By morning, she was gone. The police found no evidence of anyone outside, save for a large, rusty knife buried in the snow near the house. Gutted wildlife littered the edge of the woods, a gruesome trail leading nowhere. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Was she real? A ghost? Something worse? All I know is that I'll never take those back roads again. Thank you for joining us on this eerie journey through chilling tales and soothing rain. If you enjoyed these spine-tingling stories, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with fellow thrill seekers, and subscribe to Nightmare Rain for more haunting content. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a night of suspenseful relaxation. Sweet dreams, if you dare.